Here we're talking about, I want to talk about one group, the Diggers. And this was a group that represents that second sort of social movement, that idealistic, want to drop out. They don't want to transform society directly. That's not their intention. Their intention is to live free. Keyword, free. And how can we live in a world in which, how will we live in a world in which we make choices, free will choices about everything we do? This is very idealistic, but that was the ethos of this group, the Diggers, which themselves took their name from a British social movement of the 17th century. A faction, a large portion of the Protestants in England at this time, the 17th century, called themselves the Levelers. To level, they wanted to level the distance between the upper class and the middle class. They really weren't concerned about the peasant so much. There was a subgroup known as, they called themselves the True Levelers, but their more common name is the Diggers. And they took this name from digging in the earth. They argued that everyone should be a farmer. And why? Because theologically, God made the earth. To be in touch with God, too abstract unless you're farming. When you are farming, you're actually using God's earth. And everyone should be a farmer. And socially, this would result in equality. No one would be rich. Including, if the king was also a farmer, he'd only eat what he produced on the land. They could share the food, but again, the king would have to work. This would, if there were a king, this would level society. And the Diggers here in San Francisco were inspired by this same group. They initiated the urban farming movement in the United States. The idea of going to an open parcel of land in a city that has no building on it and putting crops in the ground. Not to actually try to feed everybody, but they were demonstrating that underneath the sidewalk and underneath the street is God's earth. Now, these Diggers here in San Francisco were not Christians. They were just inspired by the social ambition of the Diggers. The way to be independent was to be self-sufficient. They were hypocritical in many ways. They're free. The way they got about being free was often by stealing. I mean, this was they didn't want. So it wasn't very consistent in their work. They also initiated, I guess you could say, the first free food program in San Francisco too. Food Not Bombs. You may have heard of this group, I don't know. In any event, the idea is you hand out food rather than promoting. This is an alternative to be more minded, is to be giving minded with food. And most of the work of the Diggers was conducted in the Haight-Ashbury district, about 3 kilometers from here, near Golden Gate Park. And they were serving 1,000 meals or so a day for about a half a year. Anyhow, this was their big deal, their big enterprise in 1966. Again, the reason I'm sharing this story is because a few of the Diggers lived in this building for a short while during the early 60s. The Diggers were interested and also rerouting a lot of the youth who were coming here. Between the ages of 16 and 22, there were thousands of kids arriving in San Francisco during the 60s because of its reputation as being a place to drop out, turn on, do something different, change your social behavior, come to San Francisco. And the Diggers were interesting, they were idealistic, but they were also very practical. They recognized that there were not enough jobs here, there weren't enough programs to support these kids. And they thought this is just going to be a disaster for the city. So they began redirecting a lot of the youth to Northern California, where land was still very cheap, to form cooperative farms. And not many kids actually did that. Fewer still stayed, but this reputation, this ideal of you go to California and form a commune, a cooperative, captured the attention of many people, and even more people ended up arriving, so it backfired in a sense. Rather than sending more people away, it actually attracted even more folks. But nevertheless, this was one of the ideals of the Diggers. And in pursuit of this, of their namesake, the Diggers of the 1640s, who said be a farmer. And so this was their idea. Again, not theologically based, just as a practical, as they saw it, alternative to going to work in an office and doing a conventional sort of job. So my last story about the Diggers has to do with their intention and objective, their goal of being culture jammers, to surprise culture and to startle people into thinking differently. My favorite anecdote in this regard was what they called the personal frame of reference. It was a 6 foot by 6 foot picture frame that was freestanding. It had legs, and they could set it up anywhere right on the sidewalk. And with downtown during the rush hour back in the 1960s, they would invite businessmen, not that many people did this, but still, they were inviting businessmen to put down their briefcase, take off their jacket, their business jacket, and step through this personal frame of reference and be on the other side of possibility. And they didn't expect people to not go back through, but they wanted people just to have this lingering thought that I could have made a free choice. Because their argument was that most folk go to college because they're supposed to, most white folks go to college because they're supposed to get a professional degree, get married, and just have this track of their life, and then it ends here. And the Diggers were saying, it could be anything. It's like a fantasy. Live in your fantasy and live this as an act of freedom. And if they could send the businessmen back into the office, scratching their head and wondering, but I could have done something else with my life. That was their goal, was simply to create discontent. Or if not discontent, just wonder at what might have been. They were poor, starving artists, but they didn't have enough money for alcohol, and they brought some of their rich friends in to buy beer and wine, and the rich folks took over the club. It's men only, so that's weird here in San Francisco. Although gender issues are pretty fluid anymore.